Okay, welcome to the lecture on the late 1960s. Again, the 1960s are the one decade we're going to split into two lectures because so much happened during that decade. When the Beatles arrived, there was a major shift in rock and roll. Many of these genres that we'd been listening to, Motown, the novelty sounds, the dance music, the folk music, the surfer music, and the big artists in them, the Four Seasons, the Marvelettes, the Tokens, Chubby Checker, Kingston Trio, Peter, Paul and Mary, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, the Beach Boys, most of these artists will disappear and never reach the same levels of commercial success they had in the early 60s, and will be left with the Beatles and people who want to sound like them, and some remaining folk music, mainly through Bob Dylan and one of the other artists we're going to talk about. Okay, the late 1960s encompass the time period from 1965 until 1969. The most important year in that time period, as far as rock and roll is considered, is 1967, which is also known as the Summer of Love. In some ways, 1967 will be the peak of the rock experience, and it is the point at which the baby boomers are reaching the ages of 18 to 22 and going to college. And there are probably more new bands that come out who had started back in 1964 and 65 when they heard the Beatles, started to become popular in 1967. So if you remember when the Beatles first came to America, we were just recovering from the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And the couple events in the early 1960s led to newfound freedoms for many people in the United States. One of the most important was the Civil Rights Movement, which began to rule out discrimination in the public and private sector. The Great Society was the set of domestic programs put into place by President Lyndon Johnson in 64 and 65, and it was a continuation of some of the movements that Kennedy had begun. Most of us are affected by these programs pretty directly. Things like we can all buy a house and get a loan, we can all go to school, we can get things like financial aid, Medicare, Medicaid, and many of the environmental protections that are in place were put in by President Johnson during this time. Another important development was birth control in the form of the pill in the early 1960s, which allowed women for the first time to engage in sexual behavior without having to worry about getting pregnant. Vatican II took place. Vatican II was really a modernization of the Catholic Church's liturgical practices and really led to a shift in the way that more conservative Catholic families had approached religion. Another important development was the arrival of LSD, or acid, in the early 60s, much of the music and the society will be based around. I'll talk about that more in a little bit. Throughout the late 60s, the biggest event that was happening was the Vietnam War. And that will span the entire latter part of the 60s and play an important role in the developments that happen. After the Summer of Love, 1968 is going to be a year when many of these newfound freedoms, there's going to be a reaction to them. And in 68, we're going to have Martin Luther King's assassination. We're going to have Robert F. Kennedy's assassination, John F. Kennedy's brother. Charles Manson's going to show up on the scene. And the idea of some of these Summer of Love ideals are going to start to come to a close there. We're going to have Woodstock in 1969 and Altamont, which are two important festivals that help signal the end of the Summer of Love. And in 1968, there'll be a major political shift as Richard Nixon is voted into office. So coming into the late 60s, we have the Beatles. And at this point, everybody decides they want to be like the Beatles. The different genres, the Motown, novelty, dance, surfer music, those genres virtually disappear overnight when the Beatles arrive. And they bring in what is called the British Invasion. And the British Invasion is made up of several important bands from the UK. And those bands include the Rolling Stones, The Who, and Pink Floyd. In the US, there's still an influence of folk music. And folk music will be the one genre that's kind of held over from the early 60s and continues to have influence in the late 60s. The most important artist involved with that folk music will remain Bob Dylan, who we talked about briefly before, but also Simon and Garfunkel. These artists will help transition folk music into what is called folk rock. And folk rock is essentially folk music where you add drums and bass. All this is going to lead into the idea of psychedelic rock. And psychedelic rock will become the predominant genre of the late 60s. How did we get to this point? Well, the Beatles, sometime around 1965, dropped acid and they traveled to India. And acid has an effect of really changing the perceptions of the way people see the world, including the Beatles. And when the Beatles did it, everyone else decided to try it. Pretty much anything the Beatles did, everyone loved. It didn't matter whether it was music or their behavior or their movies. Beatlemania was in full effect. So when the Beatles dropped acid and went to India and explored other cultures and other ways of being, they brought that back into their music, and their music shifted dramatically from 1965 to 1966. A couple of their important albums at that time were Revolver and Rubber Soul. Many of the new bands arrive on the scene in the late 60s in the United States are influenced by the Beatles and LSD. The primary place this happens is in San Francisco, and San Francisco becomes the center of the Summer of Love, and there's some very important artists and bands that come out of that movement. Those include the Byrds, the Doors, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Santana, and the Grateful Dead. All of these artists would be considered psychedelic rock artists and were instrumental in the idea of the Summer of Love in 1967. Now briefly to the artists of the 1960s that I would like you to know, as well as the songs by them that I expect you to be able to identify. First artists on this list are Simon and Garfunkel, and I talked about them as being important in the movement from folk to folk rock music. And one of their songs, The Sound of Silence, and we'll talk about this more in the book, someone had taken their original recording of the song, which just had their voice and their acoustic guitars on it, and they added drums and bass to it. And it really helped move the folk movement into the folk rock movement, and then eventually that will lead into the psychedelic rock movement. The Rolling Stones are the first bad boys of rock and roll. They came to the United States about the same time as the Beatles, only their music was much edgier. They hadn't reached much popularity until they wrote this song called I Can't Get No Satisfaction, which is probably still one of the most popular rock songs ever written, and it catapulted them to the forefront of the rock scene. The Rolling Stones were much simpler than the Beatles. They were not the best musicians or singers or players from a technical perspective. Their songs didn't have the complexity or the melody that the Beatles songs had, but they introduced the idea of a garage band, meaning anyone down the street could throw together a couple chords and become rock stars. So the Beatles were definitely the most influential band of the early 60s, and everybody heard the Beatles and said, I want to be a rock star. And then when they heard the Rolling Stones, they said, oh, I can be a rock star. And many of the bands that we are going to hear in the later part of the 60s got their start in 64, 65 with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. The reason I call the Rolling Stones the bad boys of rock and roll is they're the first ones to establish that you didn't have to be so good. They lived their lives pretty roughly in terms of drug use, not just with hallucinogenic drugs like LSD, but lots of drinking and smoking and barbiturates and heavier drugs. Their concerts often had violence and aggressiveness in them. Their stage persona was not just out of control like Little Richard, but cocky and masculine in its approach in a way that we hadn't seen before. The Rolling Stones are going to be the band that headlines Altamont in 1969, which really puts an end to that psychedelic Summer of Love movement because there's a lot of fights and negative things that happen at the concert, again ending with one of the concert goers being stabbed and killed. Another important British band that came slightly after the Stones and the Beatles was The Who. The Who might be the first punk band. What do I mean by that? Well, they're going to take the wild antics that Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis engaged in and take it a step further to the point where they're starting to smash up their instruments. And they're the first ones to really start doing it at the end of their concerts. Their music's going to be rambunctious and out of control. We hear the song My Generation. It's really talking about that baby boomer generation coming of age and rejecting the norms of their parents. Both The Who and the Rolling Stones will have very long careers, all the way through the 70s, and the Rolling Stones are still playing music today, which is pretty amazing. An important American band at the forefront of the psychedelic movement was the Byrds, and the Byrds picked up on that folk rock movement that Simon and Garfunkel and Bob Dylan started and took it into the psychedelic movement. They are the band that brought folk rock and psychedelic together. They did a cover of some Bob Dylan songs and Pete Seeger songs, and then eventually were singing songs like 8 Miles High in 1966. I would say 8 Miles High is probably the first top charting psychedelic song from anyone other than the Beatles. And it really established the psychedelic rock movement. 8 Miles High is not really about being physically 8 miles high. It's about being high on drugs. It's a very progressive song in 66. By 67, we expect most songs to sound like that with some sort of abnormal, out of reality sounds and topics. The Beatles continue their dominance. They are becoming #1 on the charts regularly, even though their songs are becoming more psychedelic and more experimental. The mid-Beatles that we'll hear, 65, 66, if you listen to those songs, you'll hear how different they sound from each other. You'll hear some of the Indian influence in it. You'll hear some of the influence of the recording studio capabilities in terms of loops and echoes and reverbs and backwards sounds. And you'll hear experimentation with things like Eleanor Rigby, where it's a string orchestra. And by 1967, you'll hear that they've incorporated these things into a single song. A Day in the Life will sound like 2 or 3 songs put together. Hey Jude will be a very long anthem lasting 7 or 8 minutes. And that is not unexpected by the time we get to 1969. Remember, this is just a couple years after I Want to Hold Your Hand, right? 1964. Pink Floyd, the other British band that arrived in the mid-60s, was probably the most radical. When you listen to some of these songs, Interstellar Overdrive or Saucerful Secrets, you'll probably find it hard to believe that this band is going to produce the 3rd top-selling album of all time in the early 70s. You might even wonder whether they can actually play their instruments when you listen to these songs. It is probably the most postmodern music that any sort of popular rock band ever produced. It's radical improvisation. They reject our entire tonal system of chords and notes and keys. They have no idea how the music's going to sound until after they've hit the stop button on the tape machine to hear it back. And they engage in long, drawn-out, psychedelic, improvisational live performances. The remaining bands are the biggest American bands of the time and the most influential. And what's remarkable about these bands is they were able to engage in the psychedelic movement fully while producing top 10 and number 1 hits and top-selling albums and charts. And these are going to be some of the best-selling artists of the time. It's a real loss to rock and roll that many of these artists died. In fact, Jim Morrison from The Doors, Jimi Hendrix, and Janis Joplin will all die in 1970-71 from drug overdoses. The expectation for these bands is that they are going to engage in excess, that they are going to push the music, they're going to push the topics, and they're going to push their bodies to the limit. And they do so very well. These are also some of the most talented musicians to ever perform in rock and roll. The Doors are the first band to really introduce the dark side into rock and roll. The music is going to sound more adult-oriented. The themes are going to involve things like death or the Oedipus complex. In the End, you can hear that, which was their debut album in 1967. Starts talking about the son killing the father and having sex with the mother, which is a pretty radical topic to be putting into a rock song. We've come a long ways from I Want to Hold Your Hand. And yet they're still able on that same album to produce a number 1 song in Light My Fire. Their music builds a lot on Bob Dylan's influence, where the idea of the musician-poet takes place. Jim Morrison, the lead singer for the band, will perform improvisational singing and poetry over the music in live settings in a way that no one has before or since. Another important thing about the Doors is that they make use of the organ rather than the guitar as the primary instrument. Not many bands have done that before, and because they did not have a bass player, the organ player, Ray Manzarek, would play the bass with his left hand and began using a lot of riffs, meaning simple patterns on the left hand that he could play while he was soloing on the right hand. So rather than these kind of complex chord progressions that the Beatles have been having, now we're going to start using the idea of the riff a little bit more. And the Doors are the first to introduce that idea. Other bands will then pick up on it, especially Led Zeppelin, and the establishment of the riff as the dominant musical element from then forward takes place. And we still have that today. Most of the music we listen to, when we call them loops, they are actually what started out as riffs. Jimi Hendrix was the most influential guitarist of the time and probably the most influential guitarist in the history of rock and roll. He's going to pick up where Chuck Berry left off 10 years previously and elevate the guitar to a new level. One of the important things Jimi Hendrix is going to take advantage of are the new technology effects, or FX, that are available. He starts to plug the guitar into amplifiers that can have massive amounts of distortion, and then he puts them through things like a wah-wah pedal that makes the guitar go wah-wah-wah, and he has a whammy bar on his guitar which allows him to detune the guitar by shortening the strings or lengthening them so that he can get wild, dramatic bends on the guitar. And then he has things like phase or flange or effects over the guitar that make it sound like and the guitar stops sounding like a guitar really at all. It has a whole unique sound of its own with long, sustained, held notes. You'll hear that in the Star Spangled Banner. It sounds unlike any other instrument had before. And it truly becomes post-instrumental, meaning that though he's playing the guitar and playing the notes in the guitar, the sounds that are coming out of it are so much more than just the individual notes. At the same time, he's still producing charting albums and songs. Purple Haze is one of the most famous rock songs of all time. And ironically, Jimi Hendrix got his start in England. So here we have an African American going to England, back to the UK, right, to become famous and then come back to the United States. So we have all the black, white, and British American influence happening with Jimi Hendrix. I think all 6 of his albums during that time charted in the top 10, and at the peak of his popularity, unfortunately, he died of a barbiturate and alcohol overdose. The Jefferson Airplane were the headline band of the Summer of Love. They were the most popular band in San Francisco. When that happened, they were the headliners at Monterey, Woodstock, and Altamont. They were the only band to perform at all three as one of the headliners. And an important aspect of their music is they are led by Grace Slick, who is one of the few female artists to become an all-out rock star. Their music was very radical at the time. They had, again, some #1 hits like Somebody to Love and White Rabbit, yet much of their music was experimental. They would make radical uses of the effects like reverb and echo and delay in their songs to make their songs sound like they were in outer space. The topics, such as the White Rabbit, were about Alice in Wonderland and taking the pill and following the rabbit down the hole, with strong references to drugs. And her style of singing was unusual, with a fast vibrato sound to her voice, and the style of her singing was very unusual and distinct. The other major female artist of the time, and perhaps one of the greatest voices of rock ever, was Janis Joplin. She became known at the Monterey Pop Festival as well. She wasn't a headliner, but when she performed, people were blown away by what she could do. Her influences came mainly from the black gospel churches of the South. So she had a lot of influence from the African American experience. And often when people hear her, she sounds like a gospel singer more than a relatively small white hippie. Very few people have been able to do with their voices what Janis Joplin was able to do in terms of hitting the notes, in terms of the range of her voice, and in terms of the accuracy of her pitch. Christina Aguilera, Ella Fitzgerald, or other artists that come to mind, they still didn't have the power that Janis Joplin had. And it's pretty amazing if you listen to Ball and Chain and Bobby McGee, these two examples here of what she can do with her voice. Ball and Chain is a cover of a blues song, and it was well known that she was influenced by Big Mama Thornton and emulated a lot of that sound there. And then Me and Bobby McGee was one of her #1 hits. It wasn't released until after she died from a drug overdose similar to Jimi Hendrix. Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. I haven't listed it over here, but they are important, and I'd like you to be able to identify them when you hear one of their songs. They will help folk rock music survive not only the psychedelic rock era, but move into the 1970s when the Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young will still have a lot of success. And the artists that are in Crosby, Stills, and Nash were actually made up of some of the artists from the Byrds when the Byrds split up, and another important band at the time called Buffalo Springfield. You'll hear when you listen to Crosby, Stills, and Nash the idea of these 3 or 4 part harmonies. You'll hear the acoustic guitar over rock drums and bass. They also engaged in many of the psychedelic behaviors happening in the late 1960s, but because they didn't die, were able to continue with their success into the 1970s. Another important American artist was Santana, and Santana really brought back the idea of the Latino rock sound, coming to prominence at the Woodstock Festival in 1969. They were from the San Francisco area, hadn't been really well heard of until Woodstock, but when they performed, people were blown away. Along with Jimi Hendrix, is probably one of the best rock guitarists ever and most influential, and his music is going to have a strong Latin American influence in them, especially with the Afro-Latin Cuban sounds. We'll hear a lot of influence of the organ and congas, cowbells, and other percussive instruments in his music. So Santana's going to burst onto the scene at the Woodstock Festival in 1969. The last band I'd like you to know that's really important is the Grateful Dead. And this is a very unusual band because they will certainly never produce a #1 song or a #1 album. They are going to be strictly known for their live performance at these music festivals. Their performance is questionable at best, similar to the Rolling Stones, The Who, or Pink Floyd in the beginning. The Grateful Dead are never going to be known for their music virtuosity. Their pitch is not very good, their timing is off, their songwriting is questionable, but they engage in very long, drawn-out psychedelic jams that people found very appealing. Some of their songs would be 30, 40 minutes long at a time. Their concerts could go for hours. And they toured for 30 years, from 1965 to 1995, when Jerry Garcia died. People began living a culture with the Grateful Dead, living with the Grateful Dead, and simply traveling in vans to their shows. And these people became known as Deadheads. I got to go to a Grateful Dead concert in 1994 before Jerry Garcia died. It was pretty interesting because it was a real throwback to the late 60s. So the Grateful Dead are really going to bring the idea of this kind of alternative way of being and this communal anti-establishment way of being, that rebellious, not conforming to the societal norms way of thinking and being.